Hey guys, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 bringing to you another edition of the Spider-Man review series, and today, just as I mentioned at the end of the last video that I did, I am going to be talking about 2 episodes instead of 1, and the reason for that is simply because these 2 episodes are in my top 10 favourites of Season 1, but I'm going to be talking about both of them in one video because they are credited as a 2-parter and they are within the same story arc. So instead of doing 2 separate videos, I just thought it would make a lot more sense just to talk about both of them in one. And also, these 2 episodes are credited as episodes 2 and 3, and what I liked about these 2 episodes in particular is they introduced a lot of key characters who would go on to play very big roles in many seasons. Some of them would go on to become villains, some of them would even go on to become one of Spider-Man's greatest allies, and the 2 episodes that I am going to talk about is The Spider Slayer, which is part 1 in season 1, and part 2, which is Return of the Spider Slayers. And one of the first key characters we are introduced to in this episode is Flash Thompson. Now, Flash Thompson, in most of the Spider-Man media, he was the school bully in Peter Parker's high school, and he would look for any opportunity to try and make Peter Parker look stupid. But at the same time, he was quite possibly the biggest fanboy for Spider-Man, and was always defending his idol whenever Jameson and the Daily Bugle would always badmouth him. And Flash Thompson, over the course of the show, he would sometimes be a friend to Peter Parker, but at the same time he would say, look, I'll help you out, but I don't like you. I'm only doing this because Spider-Man's in trouble. Little knowing that the guy he was actually bullying was actually his idol, Spider-Man himself. And anyone who's read the comic books of Spider-Man, Flash Thompson later on would join the army and become a colonel. And in recent years, Flash Thompson also became Venom for a couple of issues. So it's quite interesting to see how Flash Thompson as a character overall has grown over the course of the history of the Spider-Man comics. But in the show, Flash Thompson was mostly relegated to being nothing more than the high school jock and bully of Peter Parker. And another key character that we would also be introduced to in these episodes is, of course, Norman Osborn. Now, Norman Osborn was a shrewd businessman slash scientist who is the head of Oscorp Facility. Now, Oscorp Facility specialised in making chemicals, weapons and robotics for Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin. And the thing with Norman Osborn is he's not necessarily a bad person, he just made a lot of questionable choices that would rub people up the wrong way, and he wasn't afraid of taking shortcuts to get what he wanted. But behind closed doors, he always had his own hidden agenda for why he would do the things that he would do. And also, Norman Osborn would go on to become one of Spider-Man's greatest enemies, the Green Goblin. And what I liked about these early episodes was they did a great job in planting the seeds with Norman Osborn in regards to the person that he would later go on to become. And he also played a key role in the creation of the Hobgoblin. And one of the first hints that they dropped about Norman Osborn in terms of the person he would become is when he was revealed that he was planning to stab the Kingpin in the back with the help of the Hobgoblin, and the Hobgoblin turned around and said to him, hey, just remember, I know your secret, I know who you really are, and don't ever forget that. So it's obvious from those words that Norman Osborn was hiding a very, very big secret. Now, it's quite interesting that Hobgoblin would say that, because Norman Osborn would not become the Green Goblin till around season 3, so it's very confusing timeline wise when exactly did Norman Osborn become the Green Goblin. But what I liked about the Norman Osborn character was he was kind of like Jekyll and Hyde. He wasn't a bad person at heart, and he would try so desperately to fight off the darkness from within, but at the same time he would quickly give in to his dark side because there was always something that he needed that he wouldn't necessarily have the guts to do, so he would quote unquote embrace the Green Goblin persona. And that went on for a number of good episodes, and it would later draw inspiration for the first Spider-Man film with William Dafoe, who done a wonderful job as Norman Osborn / Green Goblin, where you'd see Norman Osborn go in the mirror and you would see the Green Goblin speak to him. So we got to see that as well. But in these early episodes, we are just mostly seeing Norman Osborn as this shrewd, dodgy businessman who is not afraid to stab people in the back to get what he wants, but at the same time he wouldn't like it when he was on the receiving end, and usually that was always at the expense of the Kingpin, because every time he looked like he was going to stab Kingpin in the back, Kingpin would hold him by ransom and say, just remember, I will harm the people you care about, mainly your son, Harry Osborne. Now, Harry Osborne, the son of Norman Osborn, would also be introduced in these early episodes, and Harry Osborne was the roommate / best friend of Peter Parker, but you didn't see that in the early episodes. He was kind of like Flash Thompson's little sidekick, but he would later go on to become like a brother to Peter Parker. Now, what I liked about Harry Osborne's character was he was a good person at heart, and he was always frustrated at the fact that his dad, Norman Osborn, was never around, and he was always away on business, or he was always up to no good, and Harry was just left to his own devices. And what I liked about the show was they did a great job in building up Harry Osborn, because Harry Osborn would also have his own battle with his own dark side, as he would go on to become the second Green Goblin in season 4. So it's kind of cool to see where his early frustrations first stem from, and also he would later go on to build a slow resentment to Peter Parker and accuse him of stealing Mary Jane away from him. So lots of seeds were planted early on for Norman Osborn and Harry Osborn as well. And another key character we would also be introduced to in these episodes is, of course, Felicia Hardy. Now, Felicia Hardy, in the early episodes, she did show an initial love interest in Peter Parker, but would later on go on to play hard to get. So sometimes Peter Parker would ask her out on a date, and Felicia Hardy would say, okay, we can do that, but just as friends, and it's not a date. But clearly she was leading him on. But she would also go on to have a much bigger role in later seasons when she would become the Black Cat and would go on to become one of Spider-Man's greatest allies in the fight against crime. And I love the way that Felicia Hardy's character developed. She went from being a little spoilt brat who felt that, I can get any man I want with a snap of my finger, and later on become a much more grown-up and mature lady in her own right when she embraced the Black Cat persona and become a superhero in her own right. And I never was initially a fan of Felicia Hardy. I became more a fan of hers when she became the Black Cat, because, as I said in one of the earlier videos that I did for this series, Felicia Hardy, aka the Black Cat, she was like Catwoman, but not necessarily a villain, but she was very in between. So sometimes she would be a hero and sometimes she would be a villain, but ultimately down the line Black Cat would become one of the greatest heroes of the show and one of Spider-Man's greatest allies, as I said already. And she was one of my favourite characters. I liked her a lot, but in the early episodes, Felicia Hardy I was not a fan of that much. And in later seasons we would learn more about Felicia Hardy's backstory, and we would also learn about her father and her origin, about how she became the Black Cat, as well as her connection to the Kingpin. And in my opinion, I thought the show did an excellent job in building up Felicia Hardy into the Black Cat over the course of 4 seasons. And one of the things that I've always loved about the Spider-Man animated series, they always took their time with character development and story arcs. And the way they did it with Felicia Hardy was no exception, so excellent job there. And speaking of key characters, we would also be introduced to the Kingpin in this episode. And the Kingpin was kind of like the central main villain of the entire show. He was always working from behind the scenes, he was always getting other people to do his dirty work for him, and he was very clever and sneaky as the way he covered his own tracks. And he was also a master manipulator in getting other people to do his bidding, which is something we would see with him and Norman Osborne over the course of a number of seasons. And the Kingpin was like the ultimate crime lord. He controlled all of the criminal activities throughout the entire city, which was something that we would see in later years in the Daredevil Netflix show. And this would also be something that DC would apply to the Lex Luthor character in later years. And this would be the Kingpin's first appearance in the animated series. And when you see the Kingpin, he's just a big fat guy in a business suit, and you wouldn't necessarily take him seriously, but over the course of the show, we would come to learn that the fat was not actually fat at all, it was actually all muscle, and he was more than capable of holding his own in a fist fight against Spider-Man. And also, over the course of the show, we would learn more about Wilson Fisk's backstory and how he became the Kingpin. And we also were treated to a number of flashbacks to when Wilson Fisk was a little kid, learning his way up the criminal ladder and becoming a serious crime lord in his own right. And Kingpin, for his size, was very quick, and I remember in an episode, I think was season 3, where Spider-Man teamed up with Daredevil, Kingpin grabbed Spider-Man in a bear hug, and you could actually hear the bones breaking in Spider-Man's body. And Kingpin, in my opinion, was the whole package for a villain. Very smart, very strong, and very sneaky. Everything you wanted for a villain, and Kingpin fit the bill to a T. And he would go on to play many key roles in lots of episodes. He was responsible for forming the show's answer to the Sinister Six, dubbed the Insidious Six, and he also hired many other villains like the Shocker, Rhino, to do his bidding for him. And Kingpin was a fantastic villain, and he was definitely one of my favourites on the show. I would definitely put him up there with Venom in terms of being a very smart and strong villain. And the thing with Kingpin was, he knew of Spider-Man's existence for years, but Spider-Man never knew of his, and we never got to see these two interact with each other until around about season 3. That's a long time to have two guys not meet each other at all, and the storytelling and the development with both of them was just top notch, because you couldn't wait to see Spider-Man and the Kingpin actually clash, and it paid off in a big way. And Spider-Man did learn of a mystery man who was operating the entire activities of the city, but he wouldn't learn who it actually was until around about season 3. So, excellent stuff. And one of the cool moments of the show was, I think in one episode, Peter Parker actually saved Wilson Fisk, but he didn't know that he was actually saving a criminal. So that was kind of a nice little touch they added there. And like I said, Kingpin was, in my opinion, the central main villain of the entire show, and they did a fantastic job with the way they written him. And who knows, maybe one day we might actually see the Kingpin and Spider-Man interact with each other on the big screen. I mean, Kingpin and Daredevil have already clashed in a Netflix show, so they're in the same universe as the MCU, so who knows, anything can happen. at this point, but I really do hope we do see the Kingpin and Spider-Man go at it, because the Kingpin is one of Spider-Man's heaviest hitters, no pun intended, in his rogues gallery, and it's one of the classic Spider-Man rivalries of all time, so who knows really, anything can happen. And so we kick off this two-parter with the first part, which is called The Spider Slayer, where we see Spider-Man is swinging through New York City like he usually does, and he's quickly attacked and ambushed by a small flying army of robots. Now these little flying robots would play a key role in this two-parter, and we quickly learn that these robots are designed by none other than Spencer Smythe, a robotics expert who specialises in creating different kinds of robots, and we see he is working very closely with Norman Osborne at Oscorp. Now, we learn that these two have very different motivations when it comes to Spider-Man. Spencer Smythe wants to just merely follow Spider-Man, but Norman Osborne wants Spider-Man taken out of the picture. And we learn that Spencer Smythe is not necessarily an evil guy. He's kind of like a soft touch. He just doesn't want any trouble. And we are quickly introduced to his son, Alistair Smythe, who would go on to play a very big role for the rest of the show. And we learn that the reason why Spencer Smythe is working for corrupt businessmen like Norman Osborn is simply for the fact that he wants to have a hover chair designed for his wheelchair-bound son so he's able to move around better. And Alistair Smythe very rightly questions his father about why would you go into business with someone like Norman Osborn, and Spencer Smythe turns around and says to him, I blame myself for the reason why you're in a wheelchair, and I'll do anything to put it right for you. You're my son. So everything that Spencer Smythe does in this episode is merely out of love for his son, Alistair Smythe. Now, Alistair Smythe would go on to become one of the main villains of the show, and he would become more like the Kingpin's right-hand man and second in command of all of his criminal activities. And Alistair Smythe is a very smart and young, cocky whiz kid, so to speak, and we would also see Alistair Smythe become a real villain in his own right later on in the show as the ultimate Spider Slayer, where he is mutated into a half-man, half-machine sort of Spider Slayer and is able to go after Spider-Man in a big way. So it's kind of interesting to see that although Alistair Smythe wasn't necessarily an evil guy, he's quickly corrupted by the Kingpin and wants to essentially go after everyone who's responsible for the supposed demise of his father. And we are also treated to the first appearance of the original Spider Slayer, which is dubbed the Black Widow Spider. Now, for a robot that only appeared in 2 episodes officially, the Black Widow Spider Slayer was quite popular because I remember seeing toys of it in Woolworths, and I believe the Black Widow Spider Slayer was one of the main bosses you had to fight in one of the old Mega Drive games. So for a robot that only appeared in 2 episodes, Black Widow was quite popular, and Black Widow would also be a big part of the Spider-Man intro when the show started. And some of these scenes with the Black Widow Spider attacking Spider-Man were actually quite iconic moments in the show. So yeah, Black Widow was pretty cool, and as I said, this wouldn't be the last time we would actually see the Black Widow Spider Slayer. The Black Widow Spider Slayer would appear one more time in the second part of this story arc called Return of the Spider Slayers, and you'll see the Black Widow Spider and 2 other giant Spider Slayers merge into one ultimate Spider Slayer, so that was quite a cool moment. And the Black Widow's job was pretty much go after Spider-Man and take him out. So Pretty straightforward, really, for a machine that's built for evil. Pretty straightforward. So shortly after this, we see Norman Osborn heads off to a large building in the heart of the city, where he meets with a mystery man who turns out to be Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin. Now, this is the first time in this series that we have actually seen the Kingpin, and just as I said at the beginning, Wilson Fisk mostly works behind the scenes and is shrouded in mystery, and Osborn tells Fisk that the Black Widow Spider Slayer is complete and ready to go, and Fisk warns him that if the Black Widow fails, I will get control of Oscorp. And Norman Osborn notices that it doesn't matter what happens, whether Spider-Man is killed or he's not killed, you win. And Fisk then very coldly turns round and says to him, that's why I'm the Kingpin. So very cool introduction to the Kingpin, and just as I said, he's mostly shrouded in mystery and nobody is really aware of his presence and how he's controlling all of the criminal activity in the city. So this was a really cool way to bring him in. And just as I said at the beginning, Kingpin mostly works behind the scenes while getting others to do his dirty work, and I like how they introduced him here, and this would be the start of many key episodes that the Kingpin would play a big role in. And yeah, I love the Kingpin, you know, he's always been one of my favourite villains, so the show did an excellent job with the way they introduced him to Norman Osborn. And it's also interesting as well that over the course of the series, Norman Osborn, just as I said, he always has his own hidden agenda, and we would see a couple of episodes later he would attempt to try and betray the Kingpin to epic disastrous results, but that's for another story for another time. And also in this episode we also got our first mention of Mary Jane Watson. Now, Mary Jane Watson would not make her debut until the second part of the two-parter Spider Slayers episode, but she is mentioned here by Aunt May, where she says to Peter Parker that, you know, you should have brought Anna Watson's niece Mary Jane. She's absolutely lovely. I think you'd really like her. So this was a nice little cool setup to introduce one of the most important characters of the entire show, and that, of course, is Mary Jane Watson. And, you know, as I said, this first season of Spider-Man, just alone, we had so many build-ups and references for so many characters who would go on to play very big key roles in the show overall, and it's just amazing, no pun intended, how they just crammed in so much, but at the same time you never got the sense that they were rushing everything or they were just wasting time or just doing it for the sake of it. Everything meant something, and it's absolutely incredible, and they did an excellent job. And, you know, what can you really say, really? And, you know, just as I said in a couple videos back, you know, they built up Eddie Brock to become Venom, and now here they've built up the Kingpin as the central main villain. They're building up Norman and Harry Osborn, Smythe, and now we've got a mention about Mary Jane Watson, and we're also introduced to Felicia Hardy as well. Wow, absolutely incredible. And the surprises would not stop there. One of my favourite moments of this episode was when Flash Thompson, as a prank, dressed up as Spider-Man and gate-crashed the party and attempted to embarrass Peter Parker. And it's such a funny scene here, and it goes like this: Parker, it's time we had a talk. And obviously Peter Parker knows that this guy is not really Spider-Man, but he just plays along with it, and he says to him, about what, Spider-Man? About those pictures you're always taking of me. I don't like them. Okay, Spider-Man. I'm sorry. Okay, that's a little better, but it's still not good enough. Well, what would you like me to say? And the next thing you see is the Black Widow Spider Slayer comes crashing through the window, and Flash Thompson in the Spider-Man costume just goes, "Ah! Oh, okay. oh! So that was quite a funny moment, and it's one of those things where it's funny without trying to be funny, and I like scenes like that where it doesn't try too hard, and it just one of those things where you can laugh at it or you don't have to laugh at it. But I just remember the first time I saw that scene with Flash Thompson dressed up as Spider-Man. He tries to embarrass Peter Parker and he just goes, ah! And obviously over the course of this episode, Flash Thompson would go on to understand that, you know, he's no Spider-Man because, you know, he could have got killed, and Spider-Man of course warns him that now you understand the danger of this costume. So that was a really cool moment, and it's kind of nice in a way that even though Flash Thompson has always looked up to Spider-Man as a hero, I think by the end of this episode, I think Flash Thompson truly respected Spider-Man for what he does, and basically says to him, look, I'm no hero, you're the real hero, you know, nobody's going to look at me after this. So in a way, this is kind of like a moment where Flash Thompson kind of got the kick up the arse that he needed. I mean, he still acted like a prat after this episode, but at the same time he kind of matured just a little bit after this. So that was a really cool moment. I really enjoyed that aspect of the episode a lot. And another favourite moment of mine in this episode was when Flash Thompson is captured because they think they've got the real Spider-Man, and Eddie Brock is covering the story on live TV, and Jameson is watching from his penthouse and says, so that's what Brock's big scheme is. Come on, Brock, get to the point, let's see who he really is. And Eddie Brock takes off the mask and it's revealed to be Flash Thompson, and Aunt May says, I know that boy. He goes to the same school as my nephew, Peter Parker. And Jameson looks on very disappointingly and says, you mean to tell me that Spider-Man is nothing more than some stupid kid? And the real Spider-Man shows up and says, I guess you're not as dumb as you look, hey JJ? Yeah, that's him alright. He's the real Spider-Man. Nobody disrespects me like the real guy. And you know how I know it's the real Spider-Man? Because I can practically smell him. And Spider-Man very snidely takes a shot back at him and says, oh, that makes two of us, JJ. And Jameson says, why I order? It's kind of funny that even though Jameson doesn't really know who's underneath the mask, he can tell straight away who's the real Spider-Man, because nobody would disrespect or humiliate Jameson quite like Spider-Man. So it's kind of funny that Jameson knows straight away, goes, that guy's not Spider-Man, because he wouldn't disrespect me like the real one would. So yeah, he's not the man. Sorry. So I like that about Jameson, you know. He knows deep down who the real Spider-Man is, but even though he doesn't really know who's underneath the mask. And I thought the way that Spider-Man defeated the Black Widow Spider Slayer was very unique, because he could have just punched his fist into the wiring and pulled out all the circuitry, but instead what he did was he used his webbing to basically stop the Black Widow's rocket launchers from making it fly around, and he ended up throwing the machine into a vat of acid. So I thought that was a very dark but interesting way to defeat the Black Widow Spider Slayer. And also we see Norman Osborn threaten Spencer Smythe by saying, listen to me, Smythe, no spider splat, no hover chair, do you understand me? And Spencer says, alright Norman, but just get my son to safety. You can see that, you know, Spencer Smythe's not really an evil guy, because, you know, he doesn't really want to hurt anyone, he just cares about his son. So that was kind of a sad moment here, because we all know what ends up happening to Spencer Smythe. And as Alistair Smythe, Norman Osborn and Eddie Brock are leaving the building, Alistair Smythe asks, did my father make it? And we see Oscorp just get blown up, and Alistair Smythe looks on in shock and sadness as he breaks down in tears, knowing that his father may have died in the explosion. Now this was a very big moment, because at this moment, as soon as Spencer Smythe apparently dies, Alistair Smythe's entire world comes crashing down because he's got nobody now. He's got nothing left, and it's kind of sad really, because all Spencer Smythe wanted was to see his son walk again, which was why he went into business with Norman Osborne and Oscorp in the first place. So for Spencer Smythe to basically sacrifice his life so his son could live is a very sad moment, and this would be the beginning of Alistair Smythe slowly becoming the villain that we all come to know him as, and his association with the Kingpin and his criminal organisation. And this was a big standout moment of this episode, if not the biggest of the first part of the two-parter of the Spider Slayers story arc, in my opinion. And this was a really great way to end the first part of the two-parter, where we see Alistair Smythe is looking on as the remains of the Oscorp factory, and we see the Kingpin approaches him and says, "I knew your father, I was an associate of his, now I want to be an associate of yours." And Alistair of course refuses and says to the Kingpin, "Just leave me alone." And Kingpin offers him a job and says, "I will fund all the construction for more Spider Slayers to help you get revenge on the man that took your father away from you, and that is Spider-Man." And Alistair Smythe turns around and says to the Kingpin, "You can help me find the man who killed my father?" And the Kingpin says, "Of course I can. I will help you take out Spider-Man if you come work with me." And that's how part one ends. And I have to say, great episode, really enjoyed this one a lot, and as I said at the beginning, lots of cool references and setups for lots of key characters like the Kingpin, the Kingpin's relationship with Alistair Smythe, Norman and Harry Osborne, Felicia Hardy, lots of cool stuff in this episode that would help lay down the foundations for future episodes and seasons, and I quite enjoyed part one. So now we're going to be talking about part two, which is Return of the Spider Slayers. And part two pretty much picks up where we left off at the end of part one. We now see that Alistair Smythe is working very closely with Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, after he reached out to him at the end of part one to basically give him a job and said that he would help him find the people who were responsible for Spencer Smythe's demise. And this relationship between the Kingpin and Alistair Smythe would go on for pretty much most of the show's run. We would see that Alistair Smythe plays a big role in all of the weapons and technology that is being made in Crime Central, and he would play a key role in the formation of the Insidious Six. So this was a very important partnership, but at the same time it wasn't like two equals, because even though Alistair Smythe worked very closely with the Kingpin, he was always reminded that even though he's working very closely with him, Kingpin was the one who was pulling the strings and running the show. So I enjoyed this relationship a lot with these two, and what I liked about Smythe was he always yearned for a father figure after the supposed demise of Spencer Smythe, and Kingpin would always firmly remind Smythe that, just remember, you work for me now, and until Spider-Man is eliminated, you will remain here for the rest of your days. So it really depends how you look at their relationship, but at the same time Smythe would later on stab Kingpin in the back. But if there's one thing that we've learned in the show, is you don't cross the Kingpin, whether you're Spider-Man or a villain or whoever. It's just something you don't do. You just don't cross the Kingpin, and I enjoyed that a lot with these two, and these two going at it later on in the series would make for some really great storytelling and episodes. So we kick off part 2, Return of the Spider Slayers, where we see Spider-Man is talking to Aunt May, but in his Peter Parker voice, in the phone booth, and he finally agrees to meet with Mary Jane Watson for a date. Now, Mary Jane Watson was first mentioned in part 1, so they've been setting this up for at least one episode where Aunt May is trying to play blind date with Peter Parker, so we finally get to meet Mary Jane, but we wouldn't get to actually see her until right at the very end of the episode. So shortly after he hangs up the phone onto Aunt May, his spider sense goes off and he sees the Black Widow has returned, more deadly and dangerous than the last time. And then after that we see another spider slayer, this time a giant tarantula which has the power to shoot ice from one of its blasters. And what I liked about the second part of this two-part Spider Slayer story arc is they didn't just bring the Black Widow Spider Slayer back, they decided to add more to the mix, so Spider-Man doesn't just have one Spider Slayer to deal with, he now has two of them to deal with at the same time. And while he's trying to fight off both of them, he manages to plant a spider tracer on one of them to track their location. Now, the spider tracer is a big part of Spider-Man's gadgets, and he always plants it on one of his enemies or objects or vehicles so he can track their movements. So that's a really nice twist to the Spider-Man mythos, and I'm glad they always stick with that. So we see that Alistair Smythe and Kingpin are working together, as I mentioned earlier, and Alistair Smythe tells the Kingpin that everything is going according to plan, and the Kingpin threatens him by saying, "Good, because I'm very hard on employees that fail me." So you can clearly see that this isn't just an equal partnership. Alistair Smythe is just there to do as he's told. So Kingpin always reminds everyone that no matter who works for him, whether it's an equal partnership or not, the Kingpin is in charge and he runs the show. So while he's fighting off both Spider Slayers, he manages to save a little girl and her mother and their dog, and Spider-Man is knocked out by one of the Spider Slayers' knockout gas. Now this is another fun moment that's coming up in this episode, is Alistair Smythe calls J. Jonah Jameson to tell him that I've captured the real Spider-Man and I want you to come and see personally to have the honour of unmasking him. Now this is a fun moment coming up here in just a moment. We see Jameson arrive at Crime Central and he sees Spider-Man laying there unconscious and says to Smythe, "I've been waiting a long time for this. Let's see who's under that mask." And Smythe changes his mind and handcuffs Jameson to Spider-Man with a bomb planted in the middle. And there's a funny moment here where Spider-Man wakes up and says, "Hold on a minute, Jameson. When's the last time you washed your hands?" And it's quite funny, you see Spider-Man and Jameson literally handcuffed to each other with a bomb in the middle. So can you imagine how Jameson must feel that he could possibly die right next to Spider-Man? It must annoy the hell out of him. And we see Jameson and Spider-Man arguing with each other, goes, "Get this thing off me." And Spider-Man says, "I don't know, maybe he didn't send him his morning paper." You know, he's all still roasting him even when they're knowing that they're going to be blown to bits together. And Smythe then bitterly tells Jameson and Spider-Man that it's your fault that my father died. All he wanted was for me to walk again. Your friends like Norman Osborne, Flash Thompson, Eddie Brock, you're all responsible. And Spider-Man very cheekily says to Smythe that, "Wow, must be really tough for you at Christmas." Jameson goes, "Shut up." And Spider-Man goes, "Look, you know, you can clearly see the kid's not playing with a full deck here." So it's quite funny to see the two of them just arguing with each other. And we then see the Tarantula Spider Slayer drop Spider-Man and Jameson away from Crime Central. And Spider-Man looks at the timer on the bottom and says, "Look, we've got 1 hour to save everyone." And Jameson very stubbornly sits on the ledge of the roof and says, "Well, what if I decide not to go anywhere with you? What if I just want to sit right here?" And Spider-Man, in a fit of anger, picks up Jameson and says, "Look, bonehead, unless I don't save everyone, you and I are going to both go out in a blaze of glory. Now hang on to your seatbelt, pal. It's going to be a bumpy ride. And you see Spider-Man just swing off with Jameson in his arms, screaming, "Ah!" Yeah, this was definitely my favourite moment of this episode, seeing Spider-Man and Jameson handcuffed to each other with a bomb in the middle. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We then see the Black Widow Spider Slayer attack Flash Thompson, and of course, remembering what's happened to him the last time when he saw the Black Widow Spider Slayer, Flash Thompson runs away and leaves Felicia Hardy. Classy. And then we see Spider-Man uses the Black Widow's lasers to free the bomb from Jameson, but however, Spider-Man is still attached to it. Flash and Jameson run away, and Spider-Man hooks the Black Widow to a crane and lifts it up into the air. Meanwhile, we see Jameson calls Norman Osborne and warns him about the Spider Slayers. Norman Osborne appears to be confident that he can handle the Spider Slayers, and then he calls Oscorp security. Shortly after, we see Eddie Brock, after being fired by Jameson, is attempting to get another job, and the editor refuses to hire him because Jameson told him that he is bad news, but Eddie Brock convinces him that Spider-Man set me up, he made me look stupid, just give me a chance, I can prove myself. And then we see the Tarantula Spider Slayer fires a laser at Brock, but Spider-Man manages to save him, and then Eddie Brock appears less than grateful and says, "You just won't rest until you ruin me, won't you?" And Spider-Man says to him, "Look, I'm trying to save your life here, Brock, give me a break." And then as he swings away, we see Eddie Brock looks up very angrily, and the new editor comes in and says, "Jameson was right about you. I'm not hiring you. You know what? You're fired, Brock. Get out of here." And Eddie Brock very angrily looks up and says, "This is your fault, Spider-Man. I'm going to get even with you if it's the last thing I ever do." Stage set for Spider-Man versus Venom. Love it. Absolutely love it. Brilliant how just a few episodes into season 1, mainly the first half, that they've been planting all of these moments for the beef between Spider-Man and Eddie Brock, and it finally paid off, and we all know what happens after this. Love it. Then shortly after, we see Smythe is putting the final touches on his final Spider Slayer, this time a Scorpion Spider Slayer, to take out Spider-Man. And then we see outside Oscorp all the drone tanks surrounding the building and shoot as the Scorpion Spider Slayer arrives. However, the Scorpion is easily able to destroy the tanks. Spider-Man arrives and he hears the laser blasts. He then uses the Scorpion to his advantage and realises he only has seconds to stop it before the bomb on his wrist goes off. And then we see Norman Osborn order security to launch the Helidrones, which they do. At that moment, we see Smythe reactivates the Black Widow and the Tarantula, and both Spider Slayers fly off. And then we see at Oscorp, Spider-Man runs out of web fluid and changes the cartridge in his web shooters. A few seconds later, the Black Widow and the Tarantula Spider Slayer arrive at Oscorp, and we see that the 3 Spider Slayers combine into one giant ultimate Spider Slayer, and it's called the Tri-Spider Slayer. Love it. See, I remember this one very well because at the time the Spider Slayers episodes came out on Fox Kids, I remember there used to be a big box of all 3 Spider Slayers, and you could combine them into one giant Spider Slayer, and I thought that was really, really cool. So then we see the Tri-Spider Slayers are shooting Spider-Man with lasers, and Spider-Man jumps into Oscorp through the Helidrone entrance. From Crime Central, Smythe watches as the Spider Slayers attack Oscorp. Meanwhile, at Oscorp, Norman Osborn escapes in his car before the Tri-Spider Slayer can kill him. Spider-Man finds a container of liquid nitrogen and uses it to freeze the bomb, and it freezes and becomes brittle, and it breaks off his wrist. He goes, "Finally!" With only 1 minute to spare, the bomb's timer, Spider-Man swings out of Oscorp with a bomb in hand, and at that moment, at the George Washington Bridge, the Tri-Spider Slayer catches up with Norman Osborn and causes Osborn to crash his car, and Norman Osborn loses consciousness. When Spider-Man arrives, he pulls Osborn out of the car and runs with the Tri-Spider Slayer, and says, "Look, I'm not a fan of Norman Osborn, but for the sake of his son Harry, I'm saving his life." So then, as we see, the Tri-Spider Slayer flies to the top of the bridge, Spider-Man jumps on top of the Tri-Spider Slayer and places the bomb on top of its head. Spider-Man jumps off with Norman Osborn in hand, and the bomb explodes, destroying the Tri-Spider Slayer, and it falls into the river. Alright, brilliant. This was a really good scene. Loved it. We then see from Crime Central, Smythe watches as his Spider Slayers are destroyed, and he looks very angry and disappointed. And then we see a large figure walk from behind, and it's the Kingpin, and he says to him that, "We have a deal, remember? And until Spider-Man is dead, you will continue to work for me." And then Smythe puts his head down and says, "There's just nothing left." And then we see at Aunt May's house, Peter Parker is in his room sewing up his Spider-Man costume, and very cheekily says, you know what sucks about being a superhero? That there's nobody over here to sew up your clothes." And then the doorbell rings, and Aunt May says, "Get ready for your date, Peter. Mary Jane Watson's here." And Peter says, "Oh my god, I completely forgot about my date. Why don't Smythe's giant spiders just eat me up already?" And then he goes to the front door, and then we see Mary Jane Watson for the first time, and she's a beautiful redhead, and says that iconic line, "Face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot." And that concludes the two-parter episode of the Spider Slayers. Very good. Loved both episodes a lot. I have to say that what I liked about both parts was this was episode 2 and 3 into season 1, but it also did a great job in planting the seeds for Spider-Man vs. Venom with Eddie Brock's beef, Felicia Hardy, Norman Osborn, Harry Osborn, introducing the Kingpin and establishing his relationship with Alistair Smythe. Excellent. I wouldn't like to say which one was better than the other. I would probably say parts 1 and 2 were both equally as strong, so this is definitely in my top 10, and the reason why I didn't do it as like top 5 or 6 is simply because I thought it would be a lot better just to talk about parts 1 and 2 together. So yeah, I really liked it a lot. So I'm going to wrap this up now. What was your favourite part of the two-parter Spider Slayer story arc? The Spider Slayer or Return of the Spider Slayers? What was your favourite moment in these two-parters? How did you think the show did with establishing Eddie Brock's beef with Spider-Man? How did you like the way they handled introducing the Kingpin and establishing his relationship with Alistair Smythe? What about the way they started building up Norman and Harry Osborn? Did you like the way they handled that too? You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I will be back next time for another edition of the Spider-Man review series, where I'll be talking about another favourite episode of mine from season 1, and I'll be dedicating this next one to one of my other friends who just recently watched this episode that I will be talking about next, and there were a couple of issues that he had with this episode, so I'll be addressing that in the next edition of this review series. So until next time, take care everybody, and stay safe.